The dog hit the emergency room doors like a guided missile. 80 pounds of black Belgian Malinois, muzzle scarred, ribs showing through a coat, matted with road dust and old blood. Chairs toppled, a tray of instruments scattered across the floor. Nurses stumbled backward. A resident pressed himself flat against the wall and went white. The dog ignored every single one of them. He moved through the chaos like he was following a scent no one else could detect, weaving between gurneys and screaming patients until he stopped, completely still, in front of a young nurse standing alone at the edge of the trauma bay. He lowered his head, rested it gently against her knee. And for the first time since he'd walked through those doors, the dog exhaled. The nurse didn't flinch. She didn't call for security. She just looked down at him, and in a voice so quiet it barely carried past her own lips, she said, "I know. I've got you." If this story already has you hooked, follow along, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The emergency department at Harwell Regional Medical Center had a smell that never quite left you. Antiseptic layered over something older and less clean, the particular staleness of recirculated air that had absorbed too many bad nights. The waiting room ran hot in winter because somebody in facilities had never fixed the thermostat, and the fluorescent panels above Bay 3 flickered on a 17-second cycle that the maintenance crew had been promising to replace for 8 months. Nobody who worked there anymore. You stopped noticing things like that after a while. You just absorbed them, same as everything else. Nora Voss had been absorbing things at Harwell for 2 years. She was 31, though most people in that building would have guessed younger. Something about the way she moved, efficient but without the forward-leaning urgency that marked the nurses who'd been there long enough to get territorial. She had dark blonde hair she kept pulled back tightly, not out of vanity but because she'd learned early that anything loose became a liability in a room where someone might grab you without meaning to. She was the kind of woman people looked past rather than at, and in most places in her life she'd decided that was fine. Useful, even. At Harwell Regional, in Denton Falls, Montana, it was something else. It had become a pattern with a specific shape, and the shape wasn't subtle anymore. The charge nurse that morning was Deborah Sutton, who had held that position for 11 years and ran her section of the ER the way certain people run small fiefdoms, with a clear internal hierarchy, a long memory for perceived slights, and an instinct for identifying whoever was least likely to push back. Nora was her favorite project, not in any explicit way. Sutton would never say anything that could be quoted. It was smaller than that. It was which assignments landed on which desk. It was the way Sutton's voice shifted when she was addressing Nora versus addressing anyone else. A slight flattening of tone, a shortening of eye contact, the particular brand of professional courtesy that was technically courtesy and practically its opposite. "Voss." Sutton didn't look up from her clipboard. "You've got the overflow bay again." Nora picked up the chart without comment. The overflow bay was where they parked patients waiting for rooms that hadn't opened yet, or cases that hadn't been prioritized yet, or sometimes just patients that the department didn't want in the main flow for reasons nobody stated out loud. It was also where Nora had spent the better part of her last 6 shifts. She'd stopped counting. The morning started the way most of hers did, moving between curtained spaces, taking vitals, updating charts, catching the things that slipped through the gaps between one physician's attention and the next. She found a potassium imbalance on an elderly man with chest pain that had been logged as anxiety. She flagged it. The attending, a man named Dr. Pressman who wore his ID badge clipped too high on his lapel like it was a medal, reviewed her note, made a small correction to her phrasing, and signed off on it without acknowledgement. She found a pediatric patient with a fever of 103.8, whose chart said 101.2 because someone had transcribed a triage reading from the wrong column. She corrected it. The resident on duty looked at the corrected figure and looked at Nora and said, "Are you sure you read that thermometer right?" He said it the way people say things they're not really asking. "Yes," she said. He ordered the test anyway, which was the right call, and never mentioned her correction in the notes. This was the texture of her days at Harwell. Not dramatic, not even particularly cruel in any single moment, just a steady, structural erasure. The kind that accumulates over months until you start to wonder if the institution is right about you, which Nora suspected was the point. She was taking a blood pressure reading on a 63-year-old former postal worker named Mr. Anand. When the commotion started near the ambulance bay entrance, she heard it before she saw it. Not the dog specifically, but the disruption that preceded him, the sudden spike in voices, something metallic hitting the floor. She finished the reading, 148/91, worth noting, and wrote it down before she went to look. The Malinois had already cleared the doorway by then. The man with him was moving badly. Nora registered that before she registered anything else about him. The irregular gait, the way his right arm hung slightly wrong, the tension in his jaw that came from managing pain that had been managed too long. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, built like someone who'd spent decades in physical work, with close-cropped gray at his temples and a bearing that was still present even through whatever was grinding him down. He had the dog's leash in his left hand, and it wasn't really restraining anything. The dog moved where he moved, a foot and a half off his left knee, automatic. "Sir, you can't bring an animal into—" the triage nurse started. "He's a medical alert animal." The man's voice was flat, not aggressive, just factual. "He's also the reason I'm here." The dog was already pulling toward the main bay. Not frantic, purposeful. The triage nurse looked toward Sutton. Sutton looked at the dog like it was personally inconveniencing her and reached for her phone, presumably to call security. Nora stepped out of the overflow bay. She wasn't sure later why she moved when she did. Some calculation happened below the level of conscious thought. The dog's body language, the man's gait, something that added up to a number she recognized. She crossed the floor in 12 steps and crouched down to the Malinois' level before anyone could stop her, not reaching out first, just making herself available. The dog turned and looked at her. He held eye contact for 2 seconds, which was long for a dog under stress, and then he lowered his head and pressed it against her knee. The room went slightly quieter. "Easy," Nora said. Her voice didn't perform calmness. It just was calm. "I've got you." She ran her hands along the dog's spine slowly, not checking his coat for appearance, but reading it. The areas where he flinched, the spots where muscle had gone tight in patterns she knew. She felt the front right shoulder. She felt the way he weighted it. "How long has he been favoring his right side?" she asked. The man had stopped walking. He was watching her with an expression that hadn't fully decided what it was yet. "About 3 months," he said. "Getting worse the last 6 weeks." "Has he been cleared by a veterinary team recently? Military or contract?" Silence. A beat too long. 14 months ago, the man said carefully. "They said he was fine." Nora looked up at him. "He's not fine." Sutton had arrived at her shoulder. "Voss, you need to get back to overflow." "This dog has a shoulder injury that's being compensated through his spine," Nora said, not raising her voice. "He's been walking wrong long enough that his rear hip is starting to torque. He needs imaging." "He needs a veterinarian," Sutton said. "And you need to return to your assigned—" "I'm not talking about the dog right now." Nora stood up. "I'm talking about him." She nodded toward the man. "He's been mirroring the dog's gait. Right side compensation, probably chronic. And his right arm is presenting with signs of Voss." Sutton's voice had a new edge. "I'm not going to tell you again." The man was still watching Nora. His expression had landed somewhere now. It was careful. Measuring. "She's right," he said quietly. Sutton turned toward him. "About the arm." He moved it slightly. Just enough, controlled enough that Nora could see the cost. "And a few other things she hasn't mentioned yet." His name, he said when they finally got him to a bay, was Marcus Webb. Retired Master Sergeant, Special Operations, specifically a unit that worked with military working dogs in austere environments, which was the language, Nora noticed, that those guys used when they didn't want to say exactly where they'd been. The dog's name was Kodiak. He was 9 years old, and he had been with Marcus for 6 of those years, and the way Marcus said it, just the plainness of it, no sentiment performed, told her more than the medical history she was trying to extract. "Walk me through the last assessment," Nora said. 14 months ago, a contract veterinary team out of Fort Carver cleared him for civilian transition. Said his shoulder was healed from the shrapnel. Said there was no residual nerve involvement. And you didn't believe them? A pause. I believed them for about 4 months. Then I started watching him sleep. Nora looked up from the chart. Dogs don't fake pain in their sleep, Marcus said. He was compensating even when he didn't know he was supposed to be fine. She turned back to the chart and wrote that down. Not the observation, but the timeline, because the timeline was going to matter. She could feel it already. Some instinct she'd learned to trust in situations where the official story and the observable evidence were running in different directions. Doctor. Pressman appeared at the curtain. He looked at the chart in Nora's hands, then at Marcus, then at Nora again, with the particular expression he reserved for situations where she'd done something he couldn't exactly criticize, but also wasn't going to validate. I'll take it from here, Nos. He always got her name slightly wrong. Not enough to correct. Just enough. It's Voss, Marcus said. Pressman looked at him. Her name, Marcus said. It's Voss. There was a silence that lasted about 3 seconds, which was long enough to mean something. Of course, Pressman said pleasantly, took the chart from Nora, and positioned himself between her and the patient in a way that wasn't accidental. She went back to overflow. She had 2 other patients. She did her job. 40 minutes later, from across the department, she watched Pressman come back out of Marcus's bay, write something in the chart, and hand it to a resident without apparent urgency. She watched Kodiak, who was lying against the base of the gurney with his chin on his paws, lift his head and track her across the room. She thought, 14 months. She thought, they said he was fine. She went back to her work. The transfer notice arrived on a Tuesday, attached to her schedule for the following week, formatted the way bad news always is at hospitals, buried in administrative language, listed after 3 items of routine information as though proximity to the mundane might soften it. Effective the following pay period, Nurse N. Voss was being reassigned from the emergency department to the 3rd floor medical surgical unit pending a staffing review. The notice cited operational needs. It was signed by the nursing director, a woman named Patricia Olson, who had spoken to Nora directly exactly twice in 2 years, both times to mispronounce her name. Nora read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her locker and went back to work, because there were still 4 hours left in her shift, and 3 patients in the overflow bay who needed things that weren't going to happen by themselves. She told herself she wasn't surprised. She wasn't. That was almost the problem. The notice arrived and she felt something dull and tired rather than shocked, which meant part of her had been waiting for it, which meant it had been coming long enough for her body to anticipate it before her mind would admit to it. After her shift, she sat in her car in the parking structure for 11 minutes before she started the engine. It was cold enough that her breath fogged. She turned the defroster on and watched the windshield clear in a slow expanding circle and tried to decide what she was feeling exactly, which was harder than it should have been. She'd left a lot of things behind in her life. That was the accurate way to say it. Not that things had been taken from her, though some of them had, but that she had learned a particular way of moving forward that involved not looking back at the shape of what she was leaving. She'd done it at 22 when she enlisted. She'd done it at 28 when she separated from the Army under circumstances that were officially recorded as honorable and were also considerably more complicated than that. She'd done it when she came to Denton Falls and took the nursing job at Harwell, because Harwell was the kind of place that hired people who were overqualified and underpaid and grateful for it, and that had suited a version of her that was trying to be invisible. The problem was, she was getting tired of being invisible. She started the car and drove home. She was back the next morning because she had nowhere else to be and because the shift existed, and that was that. She changed, clocked in, got her assignment. Overflow Bay. Of course. Kodiak was there before she rounded the corner. He was sitting at the entrance to the bay, not the main entrance, the side access point that most staff used. And he was sitting with the particular stillness of a dog who has decided something and is waiting for confirmation. When Nora came through the door, he stood up. His tail didn't wag. That wasn't what he did. He just stood and oriented toward her with the focused attention of an animal that has been taught to mean everything it does. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. Marcus was 2 steps behind him, moving a little better than yesterday, she noticed. Still guarded, but the shoulder was sitting differently, like someone had at least acknowledged it. He had the leash looped around his wrist but wasn't using it. He gave her a look that was partly apologetic and partly something else. "He heard your voice," Marcus said. "From the hallway. He just went. He shouldn't be out of the room." "No," Marcus agreed. "He shouldn't." Nora looked down at Kodiak, who was now pressing his shoulder against her leg with a measured, deliberate weight. She felt it. The irregular texture of scar tissue under the coat on his right shoulder, the faint tremor when she ran her hand down toward the joint. "Did Pressman order imaging?" she asked. "He ordered blood work," Marcus said. "Standard panel." "That's not—" She stopped, started over. "Did he review the shoulder?" He palpated it for about 40 seconds and said the original clearance was probably accurate, and that sometimes dogs develop secondary inflammation from lifestyle changes post-service. Nora kept her face neutral. She was good at that. It was something the Army had refined in her, and then the ER had refined further, the ability to receive information without broadcasting your response to it immediately. "Lifestyle changes," she said. "That's what he said." She crouched down to Kodiak's level and carefully put both hands on the shoulder joint. She wasn't a veterinarian, she knew that, but she had spent 14 months embedded with a unit where the dog teams operated in conditions where you didn't always have a vet on site. And you learned what you had to learn because the alternative was watching an animal suffer in ways that the official reports would later categorize as non-critical. She pressed gently. Kodiak's jaw tightened. She felt the specific way the joint moved wrong, not dramatically, not visibly, without knowing what you were looking for, but wrong in a way that had a specific signature she recognized. "There's still shrapnel," she said quietly. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his breath did, just slightly. "The clearance report said it was removed," he said. "I know what clearance reports say." She stood up. "Someone needs to order a radiograph." "Pressman already, not Pressman." She looked at him directly. "Is there anyone else on his care team? Anyone from his original unit? A military vet liaison? A transition coordinator? Anyone?" Marcus looked at her for a moment. The measuring expression was back, the one that had started to form yesterday when she'd correctly identified his arm. "There was a liaison," he said, "early on. She stopped returning calls after the clearance came through." "Of course she did." The words came out flatter than she intended. She heard them land and didn't walk them back. "You sound like you've seen this before," Marcus said. "I've seen something like it," she said carefully. She straightened up, smoothed her scrubs, and considered the day in front of her. Transfer notice in her locker, overflow bay, Pressman's version of a workup. The familiar geometry of an institution closing ranks around its own conclusions. "Come on," she said, and didn't specify which of them she was talking to. "Stepan." The mass casualty event didn't announce itself. They never did. It came in at 11:47 in the morning as a radio call from EMS. Multi-vehicle collision on Highway 9, 6 miles east, minimum 8 critical, more incoming. The department had 11 minutes to prepare, which in practice meant 8, because the first units always ran ahead of their ETA. Nora was midway through a dressing change when the alert went out. She finished the dressing. You always finished what you were doing, because a half-done dressing was worse than none, and snapped off her gloves and moved. The first 3 ambulances arrived in a cluster. 2 adults with head trauma, an unconscious teenager, a man with his leg at an angle that meant the femur, a woman who was conscious and talking and whose blood pressure was so low that the fact that she was still talking was the most alarming thing in the room. Nora tracked all of it simultaneously in the way that was second nature by now. Not panic, not performance, just the processing of information in the right sequence. Sutton was at the center of the bay trying to direct traffic, and to her credit, she was doing it calmly. But the board was filling faster than the beds were turning over, and 3 of the residents were piling onto the 2 most dramatic-looking injuries, the leg, the head, which were not necessarily the most critical. Nora moved to the woman with the low blood pressure. "I need a line here," she said to the nearest resident, a second-year named Okonkwo, who was sharp and unafraid, which she'd noticed before. Sutton said the trauma bay. "We don't have time for the trauma bay. Her BP is 70 over palp. She's bleeding internally and she's compensating on adrenaline, and when that drops, we have about 4 minutes." Nora was already reaching for the IV supplies. Get me a large bore and type and cross, and tell radiology we need a fast now. Okonkwo looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he moved. Nora got the line in on the first attempt, which mattered because the woman's veins were collapsing with every passing minute. She called out fluids. She watched the monitor. She talked to the woman. Her name was Gail, she told Nora. She was a school teacher. She'd been in the left lane and then there had been a sound. And Nora kept her talking not out of sentiment, but because consciousness was a data point, and Gail's words were getting shorter, and that was data too. Across the department, she could hear Pressman's voice, authoritative and unhurried, managing the trauma bay case in the manner of a man who was aware of being watched. She could hear Sutton redirecting personnel. She could hear the second wave of incoming units on the radio. She could also hear, beneath all of that, a change in sound from the direction of the overflow bay, specifically from Marcus Webb's curtain. She almost overrode it. She had Gail in front of her, a fast tech 2 minutes out, and Okonkwo running fluids. She almost stayed exactly where she was. But she knew that sound. She leaned toward Okonkwo. Watch her pressure. If it drops below 60 systolic, you push the attending now, not in a minute, now. She crossed the department in 8 seconds. Kodiak was standing, not lying, not sitting, standing, at the edge of Marcus's curtain, and he was completely rigid, and his attention was on Marcus with the focused intensity of an animal that has been trained to communicate something specific, and has been communicating it for long enough that his patience was starting to fray. Marcus was on the gurney, still, eyes open, and his color was wrong. The particular wrong that Nora's body recognized faster than her mind could process. When did this start? She was already at the monitor. Few minutes, felt like... He swallowed. His breathing was shallow and fast. Chest pressure, spreading to the left arm. I thought it was the shoulder. It wasn't the shoulder. She looked at the monitor. She looked at Marcus. She pulled up the chart on the room tablet and found the ECG from this morning, which Pressman had noted as unremarkable. She looked at it again. It wasn't unremarkable. The change was subtle. A small, specific shift in a single lead that was the kind of thing you dismissed if you were looking for something obvious, and the kind of thing you caught if you knew what a posterior STEMI looked like when it was trying to hide. Has anyone run a posterior ECG on him? She asked. No answer, because there was no one else in the room. She got the leads. She ran it herself. 45 seconds, which was as fast as the machine allowed. She looked at the result. She picked up the room phone. I need the cardiology attending to the ER overflow bay immediately, she said. I have a posterior STEMI. The voice on the other end hesitated. Just briefly, just enough. Who is this? Nora Vossel, ER nurse. This is not a drill. I need cardiology down here in the next 3 minutes or we're going to lose him. She hung up and looked at Marcus, who was watching her with eyes that were still clear, still present, still doing the thing he did where he was taking in information and making assessments, even now. Posterior STEMI, he said. Yes. Pressman missed it. Pressman read a 12 lead. A posterior MI doesn't always show on a standard 12 lead. Did you know that when you saw his ECG this morning? She held his gaze. I flagged it to Pressman. He reviewed it and signed off. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, opened them. And now? Now you need to stay still and stop talking and let me keep you alive for the next 12 minutes until the cardiologist gets here. Kodiak made a sound. Not a bark, something lower and more controlled. The kind of sound that in a different context you might call an acknowledgement. He moved to the other side of the gurney and positioned himself against the wall, still and watching, like he'd appointed himself a second set of eyes on the room. Marcus looked at her with an expression that had stopped calculating and started being something else. You served, he said. It wasn't a question. She adjusted the oxygen delivery and didn't answer immediately. You didn't flinch when you saw Kodiak this morning, Marcus continued. His voice was slower now, the words costing more, but he kept going. You read his compensation pattern in about 30 seconds. You knew what a posterior MI looked like on a modified lead setup. And you ran that ECG yourself because you didn't want to wait for a tech. He paused. That's not nursing school, that's somewhere specific. Nora kept her eyes on the monitor. A long time ago, she finally said. Army. She didn't answer that either, which was its own kind of answer. What unit? He asked. Unit that doesn't matter anymore. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then, the dog handlers? She looked at him, held his gaze, said nothing, and the look on his face shifted, slowly, something like recognition assembling itself from pieces he hadn't known were connected until this moment. How long have you been here? He asked. At this hospital. 2 years. And they don't know. They know I'm a nurse, Nora said. That's what I told them I was. He looked at the curtain, at the sounds beyond it, the organized chaos of the mass casualty response that had swallowed the rest of the ER, Pressman's voice carrying above it all. He looked back at her. What did you tell yourself? He asked. It wasn't a cruel question. It came out of genuine curiosity from someone who probably had their own version of the same question filed somewhere they didn't open often. Nora thought about the transfer notice in her locker. She thought about 2 years of overflow bays and corrected charts and mispronounced names. She thought about Kodiak pressing his head against her knee in the middle of a room full of people who hadn't seen it coming. She thought about 14 months and a clearance report and what someone had decided would stay buried. I told myself I'd moved on, she said. The monitor alarmed. Not critical, not yet, but the pressure was trending and she needed cardiology in this room in the next 90 seconds. She picked up the phone again. And somewhere in the logic of the next few minutes, the arriving cardiologist, the team that appeared, the controlled urgency that finally matched the actual situation, she became aware that something in the room had shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but the weight of it had changed. Because Marcus Webb was looking at her with the specific expression of a man who has just realized that the quiet person everyone passed over has been doing something very specific with all that invisibility. And outside, past the curtain, past the noise, past the institution that had spent 2 years deciding she wasn't worth noticing, Kodiak pressed his chin to the floor and watched the door, patient and certain, like he was waiting for something that was already in motion. The cardiologist's name was Dr. Farouk, and he came through the curtain at a controlled jog that told Nora he'd taken the call seriously, which was the first thing that had gone right in the last 20 minutes. He was a compact man in his 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the particular economy of movement that came from decades of arriving to situations where every second had already been counted. He looked at the monitor. He looked at the posterior ECG printout in Nora's hand. He took it from her without asking and held it under the overhead light for 4 seconds. How long ago did you run this? He asked. 9 minutes? Symptom onset? He reported chest pressure approximately 12 minutes before I ran the lead. Possibly longer. He said he thought it was his shoulder. Farouk looked at Marcus. On a scale of 1 to 10. 7, Marcus said. Maybe 8. It was 8, Nora said. He said 7 because that's what people like him say. Farouk glanced at her, a quick, assessing look, and didn't argue. He pulled out his own stethoscope and began his exam, and Nora stepped back 1 pace to give him room but didn't leave, because leaving felt wrong, and she was past the point of deferring to feelings that told her to make herself smaller. The next 6 minutes moved in the compressed, hyperreal way that cardiac emergencies always did. The cath lab notified, the consent obtained in truncated sentences, the medication push that Marcus received with his jaw set and his eyes on the ceiling in the practiced stillness of someone who'd been hurt before and knew how to wait it out. Kodiak remained against the wall. He didn't try to follow when they moved the gurney. He just watched the direction Marcus went, and then he turned and looked at Nora, and she understood that she was now responsible for something she hadn't agreed to take on and was going to anyway. You can stay here, she told the dog. He sat down. She went back to work. Tut. Gail, the schoolteacher, made it to surgery. The fast had found free fluid in the abdomen, internal hemorrhage, contained but precarious, and the trauma team had taken her up within 20 minutes of Nora's initial assessment. Okonkwo had held the line exactly as she'd asked, watching the pressure and pushing the attending the moment it crossed the threshold. He came to find her afterward, not to report out, but just to tell her, which she appreciated because it was the kind of thing that usually got lost in the noise. Good catch, he said. You held it, she said. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He didn't, because Sutton had reappeared at the edge of their sight line, and both of them felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. The mass casualty response wrapped by early afternoon. 8 patients in total, 2 surgical, 3 admitted, 3 treated and discharged with follow-up instructions, and the mildly dazed expressions of people who had experienced something significant and hadn't yet processed it. The department settled back into its ordinary rhythm, which today felt slower and thinner than usual, the way places feel after a rush has passed and everyone's running on the other side of adrenaline. Nora was charting in the overflow bay. Still the overflow bay, always the overflow bay, when Sutton came to stand in the entrance with her arms crossed and her expression set in the specific arrangement that preceded formal conversations. "Voss," Nora kept typing. "I'll be done with this in 3 minutes. You ran a modified ECG on the patient in Bay 7. "I did. Without a physician order." She finished the sentence she was on. Then she stopped and turned around. The patient was presenting with a posterior MY that the standard 12 lead didn't capture clearly. A modified posterior lead was indicated. I ran it, identified the STEMI, called cardiology. He's in the cath lab now. You're not authorized to independently order diagnostic procedures. I didn't order it, I ran it. There's a difference. Nora kept her voice level. If I'd waited for a physician order, we'd be having a different conversation right now. Sutton's expression didn't change. Dr. Pressman reviewed that ECG this morning and cleared it. Dr. Pressman read a standard 12 lead that was normal for this type of MI. I'm not saying he did anything wrong. I'm saying the presentation evolved and required a different approach. You went around him. I went around the clock, Nora said. Those are different things. Sutton was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone reconsidering, the quiet of someone deciding how to proceed. Your transfer to medical surgical is effective Monday, Sutton said, per the notice you received. I read it. Given what happened today, administration may want to review your conduct before the transfer is finalized. Nora looked at her. Really looked at her, in the way she usually didn't let herself, because looking at someone that directly cost something and she'd been conserving. Review my conduct, she said. The ECG procedure. Going outside your scope. These are things that need to be documented. I saved a man's life. That's for the physicians to determine. Nora held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned back to her chart and resumed typing. Is there anything else? She asked. There wasn't. Sutton left. Nora typed the final note on her patient, logged it, and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and the cursor blinking at her in the empty field. She thought about conduct reviews. She thought about scope of practice and what the phrase really meant when you stripped away the institutional language. Who is allowed to know what, and when, and in whose presence. She'd heard that language before, in a different context from people who'd had much more specific reasons to want her to stay quiet. She closed the chart and went to check on Kodiak. The dog was where she'd left him, which somehow didn't surprise her. He'd pulled the leash into a coil beside himself and was lying with his chin on the floor and his eyes tracking the foot traffic in the hall with the calm vigilance of an animal that has been trained to observe without reacting. When Nora came in, he raised his head but didn't stand, which she took as a sign that he'd decided she was trustworthy enough not to require a full greeting every time. She sat in the chair beside the gurney, Marcus's gurney, stripped now, waiting for someone else, and looked at the dog. He's in the cath lab, she told him. Probably 2 more hours. Kodiak put his chin back down. She reached into her pocket and found a folded piece of paper she'd been carrying for 3 days without opening. She opened it now. It was a printout she'd made from the hospital's internal imaging archive, a radiograph from Kodiak's file, uploaded by the contract veterinary team from Fort Carver 14 months ago. She'd pulled it because the medical record had a reference number that didn't match the imaging system's standard format, which was a small thing, the kind of thing you noticed only if you were looking for it, and she hadn't been looking for it specifically, but the discrepancy had sat in the back of her mind since yesterday morning, like a splinter she couldn't stop touching. She looked at the radiograph now. There was something wrong with it. She wasn't a radiologist. She wasn't even, technically, authorized to be looking at a veterinary imaging file through a hospital system where it had been uploaded as a cross-reference for Marcus's intake records. But she had looked at enough radiographs in enough field conditions to recognize what a post-surgical shoulder looked like. And what this image showed her was a shoulder that had been imaged before surgery, not after. The density patterns around the joint were wrong for a post-removal site. The soft tissue shadows were wrong. The date stamp on the image said 14 months ago, post-procedure. The image itself said otherwise. The file had been falsified. She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. Her hands were steady. She noticed that about herself. The way she didn't shake when things became serious, how the steadiness was almost automatic, a reflex from years of situations where shaking hands got people killed. She sat with Kodiak in the quiet for a few minutes longer. Then she took out her phone and sent an email to a number she hadn't used in 2 years and 4 months, to an address she hadn't deleted because she'd told herself at the time that deleting it would feel too much like a decision. The email said, "I need to talk. Not urgent, but it will be." She hit send and put the phone away. On. Marcus came out of the cath lab at 6:15, 2 stents placed. Color returned to his face in a way that made him look 10 years younger and also, somehow, more tired than before. The specific exhaustion of a body that has just survived something it didn't have capacity left to process. They moved him to the cardiac unit, a different floor entirely, which meant he was no longer Harwell ER's immediate concern, and therefore no longer immediately Nora's concern either, except that she rode the elevator up with Kodiak on the leash because someone had to, and she was the only one still paying attention. The cardiac floor nurse gave her a look. "He's a medical alert animal," Nora said. The nurse looked at Kodiak. Kodiak looked at the nurse with calm, unhurried interest. "Room 412, the nurse said. Marcus was awake when she came in. Not fully. There was still the cotton wool quality of post-sedation hanging around his eyes, but awake enough. He looked at Kodiak first, who went straight to the left side of the bed and sat without being told, and then he looked at Nora. "You stayed," he said. "Someone had to walk the dog." He almost smiled. It looked like it cost him. "How bad was it?" "2 blockages, both stented. You're stable." "The one this morning was the one that would have killed you," she said, because he was the kind of person who needed accurate information, not managed information, and she could tell the difference. The standard ECG read normal for that presentation. It's a known limitation of the test. You would have been discharged tomorrow and arrested at home in 2 weeks. He absorbed that quietly. "You flagged it to Pressman," he said. "This morning. I noted the abnormality in the chart. And he signed off on it anyway. He signed off on his read of the standard test," she said carefully. "He's not wrong that the standard test read normal. He just didn't take the next step. Because you're not the kind of person he takes next steps based on." She didn't answer that. Marcus turned his head slightly to look at the ceiling. There was a quality to his silence that wasn't passive. It was working, processing, the kind of thinking that didn't need to announce itself. "The radiograph," he said. She went still. "I saw you looking at the file yesterday," he said, after Pressman left. "You pulled something on the tablet." She considered several different responses and chose the most direct one. "I found an inconsistency in Kodiak's imaging record." Define inconsistency. The post-surgical image that was filed by the Fort Carver team doesn't match the density pattern you'd expect from a joint that had shrapnel removed. It looks pre-surgical, which would mean the removal they documented never happened, Marcus said. The word landed flat in the room. "I don't know that for certain," Nora said. "I'm not a radiologist, and I'm not a veterinary specialist, and I'm looking at one image with no comparison baseline. But I've looked at a lot of imaging in field conditions, and this looks wrong in a specific way." Marcus was quiet for a long time, long enough that Kodiak shifted and looked up at him, checking. "There were 3 other dogs from my unit," Marcus said, "cleared by the same team from the same contractor. Same 3-week window." He paused. "Aries died 8 months ago. Hemorrhagic shock, no clear cause found on necropsy. His handler called me after. Said the vet who cleared him had noted healed surgical sites in the post-transition report." Another pause, longer. If the surgery was never done, Don't, Nora said quietly. Not yet. Not until we know more. He looked at her. You already know more. She exhaled. I sent a message tonight to someone I used to work with. I don't know if they'll respond. Who? Someone who tracks contractor compliance in military working dog programs. She said it carefully. Or used to. Marcus watched her face. You didn't leave the army, he said. Not the way people leave. She didn't say anything. Something happened, he said, and they asked you to stay quiet. And you did, because you didn't have a choice. And then you came here and spent 2 years in an overflow bay waiting for... He stopped, reconsidered. Not waiting. You weren't waiting. You were... I was trying to be done with it, she said. There's a difference. The room was quiet. The cardiac monitor made its regular sound. Kodiak exhaled through his nose. Are you done with it? Marcus asked. Nora looked at the folded printout in her pocket that she could feel the outline of through the fabric of her scrubs. She thought about the email she'd sent. She thought about conduct reviews and transfer notices and Dr. Pressman signing off on things because the alternative was acknowledging that someone he'd decided was ordinary had seen something he hadn't. I don't know yet, she said. But she was back in the ER at 7 the next morning because her shift had not been canceled, transfer or no transfer, and she was not the kind of person who called out unless she was actively bleeding. The overnight had left the department in the state all overnight ERs settle into by morning, tired, slightly disheveled, smelling of old coffee and compressed time. She picked up her assignment, overflow bay. She was halfway through her first medication round when she saw them, 2 people in the ambulance bay entrance who were not paramedics, not patients, not hospital staff. A man and a woman in their late 30s, both in dark civilian clothes with a specific quality of understatement that she recognized immediately. The woman had a credentials lanyard tucked inside her jacket. The man was carrying a thin folder and scanning the department with the systematic attention of someone cataloging it. They spoke to the triage desk. The triage nurse pointed. They pointed in Nora's direction. She kept moving. She finished the medication. She capped the syringe and logged the administration and turned around. They were standing at the entrance to the overflow bay. Nora Voss, the woman said. Yes. I'm Special Agent Dana Trask. This is Special Agent Willard Obie, Department of Defense, Inspector General's office. She held up credentials that Nora looked at long enough to read properly. We need to speak with you privately. Today, if possible. Nora looked at them. She looked at the credentials. She looked at the folder in Obie's hand, which was thin but not empty. I have patience, she said. We're aware, Trask said. We've been here since 6 this morning. Nora absorbed that, 6 in the morning. But they'd been here for an hour before her shift started, which meant they hadn't come because of her email last night. They'd come independently, which meant something else had already been in motion, something she hadn't started, something that had its own momentum, something that had now found its way to her door the same morning that the hospital was preparing to formally review her conduct and push her out of the emergency department. Give me 20 minutes, she said. She went back to her medication round. She finished it. She updated her charts. She told the CNA covering her section where she'd be and approximately how long. She did all of this at her normal pace, methodically, without rushing, because rushing would tell them something, and she wasn't ready to tell them anything yet. Then she took off her gloves, dropped them in the biohazard bin, and walked back toward where the 2 federal agents were waiting with the specific steadiness of a woman who had spent the last 2 years trying to be invisible, and was now, for reasons she hadn't entirely chosen, becoming very visible very fast. And behind the closed door of room 412, 4 floors above, Marcus Webb was sitting up in his hospital bed with his hand resting on Kodiak's head and his phone displaying a message from a former unit member, a message that had come in 40 minutes ago and that he had been reading and rereading since then because it contained the names of all 4 dogs cleared by the Fort Carver contractor, and beside 3 of the 4 names, it contained a single word, deceased. Kodiak's name had nothing beside it yet. The conference room they used was a small one off the main administrative corridor, the kind of room that existed in hospitals for conversations nobody wanted overheard. A round table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with old marker residue that hadn't cleaned off completely, a window that looked onto a concrete wall. Trask closed the door. Obi set the folder on the table and didn't open it yet. Nora sat down. She didn't take off her ID badge or her stethoscope. She wanted to be visibly, undeniably a nurse in this room, because the moment she stopped being that, she became something else, and she wasn't ready to become something else until she understood what they already knew. "How long have you been building a file on the Fort Carver contractor?" she asked. Trask looked at her without surprise. "What makes you think we have one?" "Because you've been in the building since 6 a.m., and you came to me specifically, which means you weren't following a lead that started here. You came here because my name already exists in something you've been working." She kept her voice neutral. "So, how long?" Trask and Obi exchanged a look that lasted about a second and a half, the kind of look that isn't actually a conversation, but is also not nothing. 19 months, Trask said. Nora absorbed that. 19 months meant they'd been building while she was in this hospital, while she was in the overflow bay, while she was correcting medication charts and having her name mispronounced by the nursing director. 19 months of something moving through institutional channels at the speed institutional things moved, which was slow, in the way that geology was slow, inevitable but imperceptible, until suddenly it wasn't. "The contractor is Harlan Vectis Group," Obi said. It was the first time he'd spoken. His voice was quiet and unhurried. "They held the military working dog veterinary contract for 9 facilities over 6 years. Clearance evaluations, post-service transition assessments, surgical documentation." He tapped the folder. "We've identified systematic falsification of post-surgical records across at least 4 facilities. 23 dogs cleared between 20 and 26 months ago. Imaging filed as post-procedure was in at least 11 cases demonstrably pre-procedure." "The shrapnel was never removed," Nora said. "In 11 confirmed cases, possibly more. Kodiak makes 12. "We believe so. We haven't been able to examine him directly." "I have," she said. "Not radiographically. But the joint presentation is consistent." Obi wrote something in his notepad. Not a lot, just a few words, like he was anchoring a thought rather than documenting testimony. "We need your records," Trask said. "Whatever you pulled from the imaging archive, whatever observations you made. Your documentation of the ECG sequence yesterday, specifically the timeline, the fact that you flagged the abnormality and a physician signed off without ordering follow-up. That's a separate matter. It's related. The attending who cleared the patient's initial ECG is Dr. Warren Pressman. Pressman has a consulting relationship with Harlan Vectis Group. He's provided peer review services for their veterinary clearance documentation on 3 separate contracts. She said it evenly, without inflection, the way you say things when you've been sitting with the information long enough that the shock of it has flattened into simple fact. He wasn't randomly assigned to Webb's case. He requested it when he saw the intake paperwork. The room was very quiet. Nora thought about the 40 seconds Pressman had palpated Kodiak's shoulder and declared the original clearance probably accurate. She thought about her flagged notation in Marcus's chart, reviewed and signed off without follow-up. She thought about the transfer notice, the conduct review, the 17-second flicker of the fluorescent panel in Bay 3. "The transfer," she said. "The review of my conduct." "Initiated yesterday afternoon," Trask said. 3 hours after you ran the posterior ECG. Sutton filed the formal complaint at 4:47 p.m. The nursing director co-signed at 5:12. "Sutton doesn't have a relationship with Vectis." "No, but she has a relationship with Pressman that goes back 11 years. And Pressman made 2 phone calls between 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. yesterday." Trask opened the folder for the first time. She turned a page toward Nora, not handing it over, just showing. A call log. The second call was 41 minutes long. Nora looked at the page. She looked at the numbers. She looked back up. "You've been monitoring him," she said. "We've had a wire authorization for 6 weeks. Then you already have what you need. You don't need me." "We have Pressman," Trask said. "We don't have the principal. The contract decisions, the falsification authorizations, the cover-up infrastructure. That runs higher than a consulting physician and a veterinary team. We've been trying to find the authorization chain for 19 months, and we keep hitting the same wall." She leaned forward slightly. You reported something in 2021 from a field assignment, a formal complaint through your chain of command about falsified medical clearances in a military working dog rehabilitation program. The air in the room changed temperature. The complaint was closed, Nora said carefully. It was buried, Obi said, and he said it without drama, the way you say a thing that is accurate and doesn't need decoration. We found the original documentation 14 months ago. It had been reclassified and routed into a contractor performance review file that was itself closed without action. But the documentation still exists, and what you described in 2021 matches the pattern we've been building for 19 months. Nora was quiet. She thought about the email she'd sent the night before. She thought about being 28 and sitting in a room not entirely unlike this one, telling a superior officer what she'd seen and being listened to with exactly the amount of attention that preceded being told the matter was resolved. The records were clean, and her reassignment was effective immediately. Who buried it? She said. Trask turned another page. She didn't hand it over this time either. She just placed it face up on the table where Nora could read it from where she sat. The name at the top of the memo was Brigadier General Curtis Aldrin, then Deputy Director of the Office of Defense Contract Oversight. The document was dated 6 weeks after Nora's original complaint. It authorized the reclassification. It cited operational sensitivity and pending contractor review. Aldrin was now a 2-star general. He sat on the board of Harland Vectis Group. Nora read the name twice. She felt something that wasn't quite anger. It was older than anger and colder. The specific feeling of a thing you suspected for years being confirmed in a single piece of paper. "What do you need from me?" she said. Well, they needed the Imogene printout, which she gave them. They needed a formal statement about her 2021 complaint and the sequence of events that had followed it, which she agreed to provide. They needed, most critically, access to Kodiak for a proper veterinary imaging evaluation by a DoD-cleared specialist who was already in transit from Denver and would arrive by evening, which meant they needed Marcus's agreement, not hers. She went upstairs at noon. Marcus read the one-page summary Trask had authorized her to share. He read it the way he read everything. Without expression, without interrupting, with the kind of attention that suggested he was also reading the spaces between the sentences. When he finished, he set it on the blanket and looked at the window. "Aries," he said. "I know." And the other two, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. If Kodiak has shrapnel in that joint that's been working its way through soft tissue for 14 months, the specialist will assess it. They'll know what's there and what to do about it. If there's nerve involvement, one thing at a time, she said. He looked at her. There was something in his face that was working to stay composed and not entirely succeeding, which was the first time she'd seen that from him. And she recognized it because she'd felt it herself. The specific unraveling that happened when you found out that something you'd been told was fixed had never been fixed, and everything that had happened since was built on that original lie. "Okay," he said. He reached down and put his hand on Kodiak's head. "Okay." She went back downstairs. The specialist's name was Dr. Renata Varga, and she arrived at 6:40 p.m. with a portable digital radiograph unit and the manner of someone who had done this in worse conditions than a hospital room and was not going to make a production of it. She spent 40 minutes with Kodiak, methodical and quiet, and Nora stood in the doorway and watched because nobody told her not to. When Varga put the images on her laptop and turned the screen, Nora looked at them and felt her stomach drop in the specific way of confirmed suspicions. The shrapnel was there. 2 fragments, one in the anterior shoulder joint, one that had migrated toward the subscapularis, which explained the shoulder compensation and everything downstream of it. The joint showed 14 months of unaddressed inflammation. There was early arthritic change that wouldn't have been there if the surgery had happened when documented. "He needs an orthopedic repair," Varga said. "It's correctable, but he should have been in surgery over a year ago." Marcus had been brought up to speed by phone. Nora could hear his voice through the speaker when Varga called him. Careful, controlled, 2 or 3 words at a time, the cadence of someone managing something they don't trust themselves to say too much about. "Will he be okay?" Marcus said. "Yes," Varga said. "He will." Nora stepped into the hallway and stood against the wall and breathed for a moment. She didn't let herself feel too much of it yet. There was still too much in motion, and feeling things while things were in motion was a liability she'd learned to defer. She took out her phone. There was a reply to the email she'd sent the night before. 3 sentences from a woman named Joe Sutherland, who had been her commanding officer for 14 months in a forward operating environment and who is currently, per her email signature, working as a compliance consultant, which Nora knew was the civilian translation of a job that still involved the same people in different paperwork. The email said, "I heard. Not from you. From another direction. It's moving faster than you think. Be careful about what you keep at the hospital." Nora read it 3 times. Then she went back to the room and told Varga she was available if the investigation needed additional documentation, and went to find Trask. Oh, Trask was in the conference room where they'd met that morning, now with a laptop and a secure phone and 2 paper coffee cups that were both empty. She looked like someone who had made several phone calls in the last 6 hours, and none of them had been easy. "The imaging confirms fragment retention," Nora said. "Varga briefed me 20 minutes ago." Trask rubbed her eyes. She'd stopped performing the managed neutrality from the morning and was operating in the slightly frayed register of an actual person who'd been working since before 6 a.m. "We're moving to formal evidentiary status, the hospital records, the original intake radiograph, Varga's findings, all of it goes into the federal case file, which means it's no longer a record that lives quietly in Harwell's archive," Nora said. "Correct. Which means if anyone connected to Vectis has access to this building's record systems, we're aware." Trask pulled up something on the laptop and turned it partway toward Nora. "We've already flagged it to hospital administration. There will be a security protocol." Her phone rang. She looked at it. The change in her expression was small but definite. "I need to take this," she said, and stepped into the hallway. Nora sat in the empty conference room and looked at the whiteboard with its ghost marks of previous meetings. She thought about Joe Sutherland's email. "Be careful about what you keep at the hospital." She thought about the speed at which the conduct review had been initiated after she ran the ECG. She thought about Pressman's 2 phone calls. 19 months was a long time to build something. It was also a long time for the people being investigated to notice they were being watched and plan accordingly. Trask came back. She sat down and closed the laptop. "There was a security alert on the hospital records system," she said, 22 minutes ago. "Someone attempted to access the radiology archive using a credential that belongs to a radiologist who's currently on leave in Arizona." Nora's spine went cold. "Kodiak's file? And your personnel record? And the ECG documentation from yesterday? Did they get it?" "The access was flagged before it completed. Our IT contact here locked the specific files, but the attempt was made from inside the building." The inside of the building. Not remotely. Not through an external connection. From inside Harwell Regional, from a terminal that was somewhere in this building at this moment. "Your agents are already looking." Trask was already on her feet. "I need you to stay in this room. That's not... Ms. Voss." Trask stopped at the door. Her voice had shifted. Less federal agent briefing a witness, more something that was asking rather than ordering. "Please." Nora stayed. She sat in the conference room for 6 minutes. She counted them by the second hand on the institutional clock on the wall, which was the kind of clock hospitals and schools used, with a red second hand that moved in individual ticks. She counted because counting was better than the alternative, which was sitting with the knowledge that somewhere in this building someone was trying to remove the evidence that Kodiak had been failed, that Marcus had nearly died, that 3 other dogs hadn't survived what Kodiak had survived, that she had filed a report in 2021 and been quietly reassigned and spent 2 years in an overflow bay while the people who'd made that happen continued on without consequence. On the 7th minute, she stood up. She walked out of the conference room, turned left, and took the stairs because the elevator felt too enclosed. She came out on the main floor near the pharmacy corridor and stopped. There was a man she didn't recognize standing near the secondary exit, not walking, not waiting for someone, just standing with his back to the wall and his eyes moving across the floor in the systematic way she recognized immediately, because she had stood exactly like that in exactly those kinds of hallways for 3 years. He wasn't hospital staff. He wasn't a patient. He wasn't with Trask's team because she knew what Trask's people looked like. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You should walk away from this," he said. His voice was quiet and even. Not a threat, exactly. A statement of available options presented as helpful advice. "Should I?" she said. "You've built a good life here. New start. Reasonable." He said it like he'd read a file, like he was summarizing her. "This doesn't have to become your problem again." She thought about 2 years of overflow bays. She thought about Aries dying of hemorrhagic shock, while his handler called Marcus on the phone afterward, looking for someone who might understand. She thought about the fold of paper she'd been carrying in her pocket for 3 days, and what it meant, and what it had cost, and who had decided it should cost that. "No," she said. He looked at her for another moment. His expression didn't change, which was itself a kind of expression. Then he moved, not toward her but toward the secondary exit, unhurried, and pushed through the door into the stairwell, and was gone. Nora stood in the pharmacy corridor for 4 seconds. Then she turned and walked quickly back toward the conference room and took out her phone and called Trask's number, and while it rang, she heard something from the direction of the record suite at the end of the corridor. Not a crash, not a shout, just a single hard sound, the kind that a door makes when it's forced rather than opened. Trask picked up on the second ring. "There's a man in the building," Nora said. "Secondary stairwell off the pharmacy corridor. He spoke to me directly, and he's moving toward records." She kept her voice flat, factual. "And Agent Trask, I think he's not alone." There was a half-second pause, and in that pause Nora heard something through the phone that she recognized. The compressed, professional urgency of someone changing plans fast. "Get back to the conference room," Trask said. "Lock the door." "The files. We have them. Hard copies. Everything's been secured off-site." A beat. "We were waiting for them to try exactly this." Nora stopped walking. She stood in the hallway and processed that sentence. "We were waiting for them to try exactly this," and understood that the evening had not gone sideways. The evening had gone exactly the way Trask had needed it to go, which meant the man in the pharmacy corridor had just done something very specific that federal investigators with a wire authorization and 19 months of preparation had been positioned to document. She walked back to the conference room. She sat down. She did not lock the door because locking the door felt like the wrong version of what she was. She sat and she waited, which was the hardest thing. And she was still sitting there 22 minutes later when the door opened and Trask came in with Obi behind her and a third person Nora hadn't seen before. And Trask looked at her with an expression that had something in it that hadn't been there that morning. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to respect. The kind that comes from watching someone hold a position under pressure. "We have him," Trask said, "and we have what he tried to take." "Who sent him?" Nora said. Trask sat down. She opened the laptop again. She turned it toward Nora, and on the screen was a photograph taken from security footage. Grainy, time-stamped 40 minutes ago, a man on a phone in the hospital parking structure. And behind him, barely in frame, the tail end of a vehicle with a government-issue plate. "Aldrin," Nora said. "He was in Denver this morning," Trask said. "He flew commercial. Checked into a hotel under a consulting firm name. Made 3 calls in the last 6 hours, 2 of which we have audio of." She closed the laptop. "He knows the investigation is active. He's trying to collapse it before we can get to the authorization chain. Which means you're running out of time." "Which means we're running out of time," Trask said. The distinction sat in the room between them. Nora looked at the empty coffee cups on the table. She thought about what running out of time looked like from both sides of this. From Aldrin's side, the narrowing window before federal charges landed, and from hers, the narrowing window before whoever was connected to Aldrin decided that a nurse in an overflow bay in Denton Falls, Montana had become a problem that required a more direct solution. "He's going to come to the hospital," Nora said. Trask didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "Not tonight," Obi said. "Tonight he needs to reassess. The attempt on the records failed. He knows that now. He'll want to talk to me himself," Nora said. "That's how these men operate. They don't send someone twice. They come to make sure the message is delivered correctly." She said it from a specific knowledge, the kind you didn't get from reading files. Trask looked at her, and something in that look confirmed it. "We'd like you to stay at the hospital tonight," Trask said. "We can arrange—" I know, Nora said. I'm not leaving. She pulled out her phone. There was a new message from Marcus, sent 11 minutes ago from his room 4 floors above them. 2 sentences that he'd clearly typed carefully, because the words were more precise than someone texting casually. I know what's happening. I've been in enough rooms to recognize the shape of it. Whatever you're being asked to do, I'm a resource, not a liability. Use me. She read it twice. She wrote back one word. Tomorrow. Then she put the phone face down on the table and looked at the ghost marks on the whiteboard and thought about a 2-star general in a Denver hotel making phone calls, and a dog on the 4th floor with shrapnel in his shoulder that should have been removed 14 months ago, and a report she had filed in 2021 that had been buried by a man who was now sitting on the board of the company that had done the burying. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about what it was going to cost and whether she had it, and decided that was the wrong question. Not whether she had it, but whether she was going to spend it, and on what, and for whom. Outside the conference room, the hospital moved through its night rhythms, the PA system, the elevator chimes, the distant sound of a monitor alarm resolving. And somewhere in the parking structure beneath the building, federal agents were processing an arrest and securing a phone that contained, among other things, a call log that connected a man in a pharmacy corridor to a general who had spent 2 years believing that Nora Voss had accepted her reassignment and moved on. He was about to find out how wrong he was. He came on the 2nd day. Nora had known he would. Not the timing exactly, but the shape of it. The way men like Aldrin operated, the specific calculus of someone who had spent a career making problems disappear through intermediaries and was now confronting the reality that the intermediary had failed and the problem was still standing. You didn't send a second proxy. You came yourself, because coming yourself was a form of pressure that proxies couldn't replicate. It communicated something that phone calls and messengers couldn't, that you considered the situation important enough to be present for it, and that your presence was itself supposed to mean something. Brigadier General Curtis Aldrin arrived at Harwell Regional at 11:15 in the morning in civilian clothes, good wool coat, no insignia, the kind of understated authority that didn't need decoration. He came through the main entrance, not the ambulance bay, and he walked to the information desk and asked for Nora Voss in the manner of someone making a reasonable, unremarkable request. Nora was in the overflow bay. She knew he was there 40 seconds after he arrived, because Obi had positioned a member of their team at the information desk since the previous evening, and the text came through while she was documenting a medication round. She finished the medication round. Then she went to meet him. They'd set up a room. Not the conference room from before, a different one floor up, with better angles and a reason for the specific placement of furniture that Nora understood when she walked in and saw where the chairs were. She was wearing a transmitter that Trask had fitted that morning, a thin adhesive unit along her left ribs, so unobtrusive that she'd forgotten about it twice and had to consciously remember not to press her arm against it. The signal was going to a receiver in a vehicle parked on the north side of the building, where Trask and Obi were sitting with a federal recording system and authorization that had been in place for 6 weeks. Aldrin was already in the room when she arrived. He was standing near the window, not looking out of it, just standing near it, a positioning choice that put him with his back to the light. It was the kind of thing you did when you'd spent decades in rooms where positioning mattered, and Nora noticed it without letting it land. She sat down at the table. She didn't offer her hand. He looked at her for a moment, taking inventory, she understood, calibrating, and then he sat down across from her with the relaxed posture of a man who intended to be underestimated. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "You're here." Something almost like appreciation moved across his face. "I heard you've had a difficult week." "I've had an informative week," she said. He nodded slowly. He was in his late 50s, with the compacted build of someone who'd stayed physically disciplined past the age when it was easy, and a face that had the texture of someone who'd spent time in real conditions rather than behind desks. She'd known men like him, had worked under them, had respected some of them, and had learned that the respectable ones and the dangerous ones often came in the same exterior. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "That would be new," she said. He absorbed that without reacting. "What happened with your 2021 report was mishandled. The reclassification decision was made in the context of an ongoing contractor review process, and the concern was that premature disclosure would compromise a separate investigation. In retrospect, which investigation? She said. He paused. The separate investigation that justified burying my report, she said. What was it? What were they looking at? What did it produce? He looked at her steadily. I'm not in a position to, there wasn't one, she said. The reclassification memo cites operational sensitivity and pending contractor review. The contractor review was closed 3 months later with no findings. There was no separate investigation. The report was buried because the contractor was a revenue source for people who had the authorization to make reports disappear. She kept her voice even. I've seen the documentation. All of it. The room was quiet for a moment. Aldrin shifted slightly. Not much. Just a recalibration, the kind you made when a conversation was going differently than anticipated. I came here because I think you're an intelligent person who understands how these situations work, he said. The investigation the DoDIG is running is going to cause significant disruption to programs that serve real operational needs. The contractor relationships involved aren't simply corrupt. They're embedded in procurement systems that support active units. Pulling that thread doesn't just bring down bad actors, it creates gaps. In veterinary contracts, she said, in a broader network of service relationships. 23 dogs, she said. 11 confirmed with retained shrapnel. 3 dead. Kodiak's still alive because I happened to be in the right overflow bay on the right day. She leaned forward slightly. You flew commercial from Denver and walked into this hospital to explain operational gaps to me. He looked at her for a long moment. The relaxed posture was still there, but something underneath it had become more deliberate, more effortful. What do you want? He said. I want you to say clearly, in this room, what you authorized, she said. Another pause. Longer this time. I authorized a reclassification, he said carefully, based on information I was provided at the time. By whom? By the contractor's compliance office. Harlan Vectis Group told you my report was sensitive, and you reclassified it based on their recommendation. It was a coordinated decision across— Who else? She said. He stopped. She watched him calculate. The distance between what he'd said and what was demonstrable, the specific gap that people like him spent careers managing. I think, he said slowly, that this conversation has reached its natural limit. I agree, Nora said. She stood up. He looked at her, and she could see the moment he understood that the conversation had not gone the way he'd planned it, that she had not been the audience for a message, but the operator of something he hadn't identified until it was too late to change course. She walked out of the room and left him there. In the vehicle on the north side of the building, Trask pulled off her headphones and looked at Obi. Coordinated decision, Obi said. Contractor's compliance office providing recommendation to an authorized reclassification official, Trask said. That's conspiracy to suppress a federal complaint. That's obstruction. She picked up her phone. And he set it on a live federal wire. She made the call. Nora walked back down to the ER. She returned to the overflow bay. She picked up the next chart and resumed work. Because the patients didn't stop, and neither did she. And because standing still afterward felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite articulate except that she needed the familiar weight of the work to hold herself inside of. She was 20 minutes into a medication reconciliation when Trask appeared at the entrance to the bay. He's being detained, Trask said. Federal agents met him in the lobby. He's being transported to the field office in Billings for formal questioning. She paused. He didn't resist. I want you to know that he understood what was happening. Nora wrote something in the chart. He knew before he walked in, she said. He came here to see if there was still a way out. There wasn't. No, Trask said. There wasn't. Nora capped the pen. The people above him, Vectis leadership, the compliance office staff who communicated with him. We have the wire. We have his statement implicating the contractor's communication. We have 19 months of documentation. Trask's voice was measured, but there was something underneath it. Not satisfaction exactly, more like the particular relief of weight that had been carried a long time being set down. This is enough. This is more than enough. Nora nodded. She picked up the next chart. There's one more thing, Trask said. Something in her tone made Nora stop. The hospital's HR office received a formal complaint this morning, Trask said, filed by Dr. Pressman. It alleges that you accessed patient records without authorization, specifically the imaging archive, and that your actions during the mass casualty event exceeded your scope of practice and placed patients at risk. She said it carefully, the way you say things that are simultaneously true and wrong. We have reason to believe the complaint was drafted with assistance from someone connected to Vectis. It's designed to preempt your credibility as a witness by creating an official HR record of misconduct before federal proceedings become public. Nora was quiet for a moment. Of course it is, she said. The hospital is required to investigate. I know. That process could take weeks, Nora said. I know how it works. She set down the chart. Can you block it? Not directly. The HR process is internal. We can flag its origins to hospital administration, but we can't compel them to dismiss it. So I'm suspended pending investigation while a federal case against the contractor who tried to bury me moves through the system. It's possible, yes. Nora looked at the overflow bay. The bed she'd changed that morning, the monitor with the number she'd noted and logged, the chart she'd been working on. 2 years of this room. 2 years of corrected notations and wrong name sign-offs and fluorescent panels no one ever fixed. Okay, she said. Okay. I'm not going anywhere, she said. If they suspend me, I'll be suspended in this building. If they want to investigate, they can investigate. She picked up the chart again. I have work to do. Trask looked at her for a moment. She opened her mouth, seemed to reconsider something, and then said simply, We'll move as fast as we can. She left. Nora finished the medication reconciliation. The suspension notice came at 3:15 in the afternoon, delivered by Patricia Olson herself, which was the first time the nursing director had come to the ER floor in Nora's memory. She came with a printed document and an expression that was trying to project administrative gravity and achieving mostly discomfort. She handed Nora the suspension notice in the overflow bay in front of 2 CNAs and a patient who was technically asleep but probably wasn't. Effective immediately, Olson said, pending completion of the conduct review. Nora read the document. She read all of it, the full page, while Olson waited with the specific energy of someone hoping the reading would be shorter than it was. Okay, Nora said. She handed the document back. Olson blinked. You'll need to... I know the process. Nora pulled off her gloves. Can I finish logging this patient's last vitals before I go? It'll take 3 minutes. Otherwise, the next nurse is going to have a gap in the record. Olson opened her mouth, closed it. 3 minutes, she said. Nora logged the vitals. She updated the chart note. She said a few words to the patient, who was not asleep, in a voice that was quiet enough that Olson, standing at the bay entrance, couldn't hear what was said but could see the patient nod. Then she clipped her badge to her pocket, picked up her bag from the locker, and walked out of the emergency department. She did not take the exit. She took the stairs to the 4th floor. Marcus was sitting up, no longer connected to the cardiac monitor, which meant he'd crossed whatever threshold had cleared him for reduced oversight. He looked significantly better than he had 2 days ago. Not good, but present in a way that had been uncertain before. Kodiak was on the floor beside him, and both of them looked up when she came in. She sat in the chair she'd been using and said, I've been suspended. I heard, Marcus said. Okonkwo texted me. Of course he did. He also said every nurse in the ER is aware of the Pressman complaint, and that at least 3 of them have already offered to provide statements to HR contradicting it. Nora looked at him. You have more allies than you know, Marcus said. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She filed it. How's the shoulder? She asked, meaning his. Manageable. The cardiologist says the stents are stable. They want me ambulatory by tomorrow. Good. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Kodiak, who was watching Nora with the calm, direct attention he'd been directing at her since the first day. Varga scheduled the surgery for Friday, Marcus said. She says the fragments are positioned for clean removal. No nerve involvement confirmed on the imaging. He should have full recovery with appropriate rehab. He paused. Because you pulled that imaging file. I pulled it because the reference number was wrong, she said. That's all. It was a notation error that I couldn't stop thinking about. You couldn't stop thinking about it because you were trained to notice things like that. Maybe. Not maybe. He leaned back slightly. You've been treating this like it was an accident, like you happened to be in the right place. It wasn't an accident. You spent 2 years in that overflow bay and you kept your eyes open, and when something came through that connected to what you'd seen before, you recognized it. That's not luck. That's what you are. She looked at the window, the concrete wall beyond it, the narrow strip of sky above it. I got pushed out, she said, both times. The army and now here. You're not pushed out now, he said. You're suspended, pending a review, of a complaint that was filed by someone who's already been detained for questioning by federal investigators. His voice was dry. Those are different situations. She almost smiled. That's a specific kind of optimism. It's arithmetic, he said. Trask called her at 6 p.m. She took it in the fourth-floor family waiting area, sitting in a chair beside a window that actually had a view. Parking lot, mountains in the far distance, the particular Montana dusk that came in colors you didn't expect. Vectis compliance director is cooperating, Trask said without preamble. He came in voluntarily 3 hours ago with representation. He's been talking since 4. What's he giving you? The authorization chain above Aldrin. There are 2 additional officials involved in the 2021 suppression, 1 currently active duty, 1 retired and sitting on a Vectis subsidiary board. He's also given us the internal communications that show deliberate falsification of surgical records across the full 23-dog cohort. Not 11. 23. Nora closed her eyes briefly, opened them. All 23, she said. All 23. The surgical procedures were billed. The documentation was filed. The surgeries were not performed. She thought about what that meant in terms of money. The billing, the contracts, the amounts that had moved through legitimate-looking channels, while 23 animals carried metal in their bodies and declined in ways their handlers watched and reported and were told were lifestyle adjustment issues. What happens to Vectis, she said. Federal contract suspension effective as of this evening. Criminal referrals for the principals. Civil liability exposure that their legal team is probably already losing sleep over. A pause. Aldrin invoked counsel about 20 minutes ago. He stopped talking, but what he said on the wire this morning is sufficient for federal charges. The conspiracy count alone carries, I don't need the sentencing breakdown, Nora said. No, Trask said. I suppose you don't. She paused. The HR complaint Pressman filed. We've formally notified the hospital's legal counsel that it was drafted in coordination with a party currently under federal investigation. They're reviewing. How long? Unknown. But their exposure if they proceed with a suspension based on a complaint connected to an obstructionist actor is significant. Their lawyers will tell them that. Nora looked at the mountains. They were turning colors she didn't have names for. Pressman, she said. Still employed, Trask said. That's a hospital matter. We can't compel employment decisions. A beat. His consulting contract with Vectis is obviously terminated, and his name appears in communications regarding the coordination of the complaint against you, which is relevant to your HR process, even if it doesn't create criminal exposure for him directly. She thought about Pressman reviewing the ECG that morning, signing off on it. She thought about whether he'd known specifically what he was doing or whether he'd been operating in that comfortable zone of deliberate incuriosity, not actively suppressing something but not looking directly at it either. She decided it didn't matter much. The result was the same. Okay, she said. There's one more thing, Trask said. This was apparently a phrase she used when she had things that required their own sentence. Go ahead. We're going to need your formal testimony, not just a statement, testimony, on the record, regarding your 2021 complaint, your observations of Kodiak's presentation, the imaging discrepancy, and the sequence of events this week. That testimony is going to be part of federal proceedings. A pause. It will be public record. I know what testimony means, Nora said. Your name will be visible. Your service record will be referenced. The suppression of your original report will be documented in federal filings. She said it carefully. I want you to know what you're choosing. Nora looked at the parking lot below, the the cars arranged in their ordinary rows, the regular movement of people going in and out of a building where ordinary things happened. A man walking a dog on the far sidewalk. Two nurses sharing something on a phone by the entrance, laughing. "I'm choosing it," she said. "What?" She slept in the on-call room that night because Trask had asked her to stay accessible and because going home felt like the wrong kind of removing herself from what was in motion. The on-call room was a small space with a cot that had been used by enough tired people that it had acquired a texture all its own, and she lay on it in her clothes and looked at the ceiling and thought about 2021 and what she'd believed at the time about how institutions worked, which was that they were slow, but they corrected, given enough pressure and enough time. She hadn't been wrong, exactly. She'd just underestimated the time. She was asleep by 10 and awake at 5:30, which was her body's habit regardless of circumstances. She showered in the staff bathroom, changed into fresh scrubs she'd brought in her bag because she'd learned a long time ago to always have fresh scrubs, and went to check on Marcus and Kodiak before anything else. Kodiak was awake. Marcus was still sleeping, genuinely sleeping. Not the shallow drift of someone in pain managing it, but the real thing, which she noted as a good sign and let alone. She sat with the dog in the early quiet of the floor and felt the morning settle around her, the particular stillness of a hospital before the day shift fully arrived. Her phone buzzed at 6:10. A text from Okonkwo. "Pressman didn't come in this morning. HR is meeting at 8. The director called in her deputy. Something's moving." She read it twice and put the phone face down on her knee. At 6:47, Trask appeared in the doorway of room 412, which told Nora she'd been in the building since before that, which meant she'd been in the building most of the night, which tracked. Vectis CFO surrendered to federal authorities in Denver at 6 a.m., Trask said. He had a flight booked to Toronto. We had a hold on his passport. "Was he going to make it?" Nora asked. "No," Trask said simply. "The net has been in place since Tuesday. We've been letting it tighten." She leaned against the doorframe. "The hospital's legal counsel contacted our office at 6:15. They're withdrawing the suspension pending a full review of the complaint's origins. You're reinstated as of right now." Nora looked at her. "You can go back to the ER," Trask said. She thought about the overflow bay. She thought about what reinstated meant in practice. Going back to the same assignment, the same charge nurse, the same 17-second flicker above Bay 3. "Is Sutton still charged?" she asked. "As far as I know." "And Olson?" "Yes." She nodded. "Okay." Kodiak stood up and pushed his nose against her hand. "The formal testimony," Trask said. "We'd like to schedule it for Monday, in Billings. Can you—" "Yes," Nora said. "There will be press," Trask said. "Not at the testimony itself. But when the federal charges are filed publicly, your name will be in the filing. It's going to generate attention." "How much?" "A decorated combat medic turned ER nurse who identified systematic fraud in a military contractor, was suppressed, spent 2 years being overlooked, and then broke the case open from an overflow bay." Trask said it without inflection, but there was something in it. Significant attention. Nora looked at the dog. She looked at Marcus sleeping, the even rise of his chest, the color in his face that hadn't been there 3 days ago. She thought about the man in the pharmacy corridor. "You've built a good life here. New start. Reasonable." The way he'd said it like it was a compliment and a threat simultaneously. She thought about what the life she'd built here had actually been. 2 years of being handed the overflow and making the best of it. 2 years of catching what other people missed and having it signed off on without acknowledgement. 2 years of a transfer notice she'd been waiting for since the first month, when she'd understood the shape of the place. She'd called it being done with it. Marcus had called it something else. "I'm going to go to the ER," she said. She stood up. She smoothed her scrubs. She put her phone in her pocket. She looked at Trask and said, "Thank you for coming here yourself. You didn't have to." Trask looked back at her steadily. "Neither did you. In 2021, you didn't have to file that report. You could have—" "I know," Nora said. She walked out of room 412 and took the stairs down to the emergency department and pushed through the doors into the familiar noise and smell of it, the antiseptic and the old air and the monitor sounds, and the particular texture of a place she'd spent 2 years in, which looked different now, not because anything in it had changed, but because she was standing in it differently. Sutton looked up from the charge desk. Her expression moved through several stages in quick succession. Nora picked up the next chart. "I'm back," she said, and went to work. She was 40 minutes into her shift, moving through the bay with the efficient rhythm that was muscle memory by now, when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't open it. She opened it. It was a photograph, a screenshot of an internal Harwell email chain dated that morning with subject line, Staffing Review, Emergency Department. The email chain showed 3 messages. The first was from the hospital's chief medical officer, a man named Dr. Halverson, who had never spoken directly to Nora in 2 years, addressed to Olson and the board liaison. The second was from the board liaison. The third was from Halverson again. The third email contained 2 sentences. Effective immediately, Dr. Pressman's privileges are suspended pending review of his consulting relationships and associated decisions. Additionally, I'd like a full report on the emergency department's nurse assignment protocols, specifically why a nurse with Ms. Voss's documented competency has been assigned to overflow for the duration of her employment here. Nora read it twice. She read it a third time because the third time was when it became real rather than words. She didn't know who had sent her the screenshot. She suspected Okonkwo, though it could have been any of 3 other people. She put the phone back in her pocket and kept moving. At 9:30, Trask appeared again. Not in the department this time, but visible through the glass of the ambulance bay doors, standing outside with Obi and 2 other people Nora hadn't met, all of them looking at a phone. The particular body language of people receiving information they'd been waiting a long time to receive. Okonkwo materialized at Nora's elbow. "What's happening out there?" "Something good," she said. "Keep moving." At 10:15, Trask came inside. She walked directly to Nora, who was documenting a triage assessment, and waited until Nora looked up. "Aldrin accepted a plea agreement 40 minutes ago," Trask said, low enough that it didn't carry. "Full cooperation. He's giving us the 2 additional officials and the complete financial trail from Vectis to the falsification program, in exchange for—" She paused. "He wanted to negotiate. His counsel was told there was nothing to negotiate." Another pause. "He cooperated anyway." "Because the wire gave you everything you needed, and he knew it," Nora said. "Yes. So he's cooperating to minimize his sentence rather than because he has a choice." "Yes," Trask said, "but the outcome is the same. The chain is exposed. All of it." Nora put down her pen. She looked at the board. 7 patients, 2 in critical bays, 1 pending labs, 1 awaiting consult. The regular geography of a morning in an emergency department. "How many people knew about the falsification?" she asked. "Above Aldrin. At least 4, possibly 6. Trask said it quietly. "All of them will be in federal filings within the week." Nora thought about 2021. She thought about sitting in a room not unlike this one and being told the matter was resolved. She thought about the specific feeling of being believed just enough to be handled and not enough to be heard. "I need to tell you something," Trask said. Her tone had changed. Nora looked up. "When we found your 2021 complaint in the reclassified file 14 months ago," Trask said, "we tried to locate you. It took us 3 weeks. You'd left no forwarding contact through official channels." She paused. "When we found you here, we made a decision not to approach you. We needed the investigation to develop independently, without your active participation, because your prior complaint made you a named party, and we didn't want your testimony compromised by appearing coordinated." She held Nora's gaze. "We've been aware of your location for 14 months. We watched Harwell's treatment of you through the HR filings we subpoenaed. We knew about the transfer notice 2 days before you received it." The room was very quiet around them. "You watched," Nora said. "We needed the case to be clean," Trask said. "If we'd come to you first, the defense would have argued—" "I know what the defense would have argued," Nora said. She picked up her pen. She wrote something in the chart. She was aware of her own breathing, steady, even, the kind of breathing she'd trained into herself a long time ago. "You let them transfer me," she said. "We couldn't intervene in internal HR processes without—" "I know," Nora said. "I know why." She finished the chart note. She filed it. She thought about whether she was angry. She examined the feeling and found that it was more complicated than anger. It had anger in it, but also something else, the recognition that institutions moved in the ways they moved for reasons that were sometimes legitimate and sometimes self-protective, and often both simultaneously, and that she had navigated that before and had apparently navigated it again without knowing it. She had been a piece on a board that she couldn't see, and she had still made the right moves. "Is there something you need from me right now?" she asked. "No," Trask said. "I just thought you deserved to know." "All right," Nora said. She moved to the next patient. She picked up the next chart. At 11:45, she was rechecking a post-reduction dressing when Okonkwo came through the bay fast, not running, but close, with an expression that made her stop what she was doing. "Sutton just got called to Olson's office," he said. "Okay." "With the board liaison." She looked at him. "And Halverson," Okonkwo said. She turned back to the dressing. She pressed the tape at the edge with 2 fingers and checked the seal. She thought about what that meeting contained, and what would come out of it, and what the next version of this department might look like, and whether the fluorescent panel above Bay 3 would finally be fixed. She thought about Kodiak upstairs, waiting for Friday's surgery with the patience of an animal that had endured what it had endured and was still, somehow, willing to walk toward the people who offered their hands. She thought about Marcus's text. "Whatever you're being asked to do, I'm a resource, not a liability." She thought about the federal proceedings on Monday, her name in the filing, the shape of what came next. She finished the dressing, she logged it, she went to the next patient because that was the work, and the work didn't stop, and she didn't stop either. At 12:03, Trask appeared in the ambulance bay doorway for the 3rd time that day, and this time she was not alone. Beside her was a man Nora had never seen, in his 50s, in a suit that was too formal for Denton Falls, holding a thin briefcase. He was looking at Nora with the expression of someone who had reviewed a file and is now matching the file to the person and finding the person considerably more than the file had prepared him for. Trask raised her hand slightly. Not a wave, something more deliberate. And Nora understood that whatever was about to happen was not bad news. She held up one finger. She finished what she was doing. She logged the note. Then she walked toward the ambulance bay, and the man in the suit extended his hand and said his name was Deputy Inspector General Marsh, and said that he had personally reviewed the full investigation file and her 2021 complaint documentation, and that he was here because some things needed to be said in person rather than through channels. He said several of those things. Nora listened to all of them, and when he finished, she said, "I need to ask you something." "Of course," he said. "The 3 dogs that died," she said, "Aries and the others. Are their records going to be part of the federal filing? Are they going to be named?" He looked at her with an expression that took a moment to settle. "Yes," he said. "They will be." "Good," she said. She shook his hand. She went back to work. She was at the nursing station, updating the board, when Sutton emerged from the elevator. Not from the direction of Olson's office, but from the elevator, which meant she'd left through a different exit, which meant the meeting had not gone the way she'd expected. And from the set of her face and the particular way she was carrying herself, it had not gone well. She walked across the ER floor without looking at anyone specifically, clocked out at the desk, and left through the main entrance. No one said anything. The department kept moving. Nora updated the board. She moved a patient from triage to Bay 2. She called the lab about a pending result. At 1:17 in the afternoon, her phone buzzed. It was Marcus. 4 words. "They're letting me walk." She read it and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite joy, but was somewhere in the neighborhood of both. The specific warmth of a thing that has been uncertain becoming certain. She typed back, "How's the shoulder?" His response came 10 seconds later. "Ask me again after Friday." Then, after a pause, "He's ready." He keeps looking at the door. She smiled at her phone in the middle of the emergency department, which was the first time she'd done that in as long as she could remember. Then she put the phone away, picked up the next chart, and turned toward the sound of the ambulance bay doors opening as the next patient arrived, because the work kept coming, and she was still here, and that was in the end exactly what she'd intended. She was midway through the triage assessment when Trask appeared one final time, and she was moving differently than she had all day, with something contained and purposeful that Nora registered before Trask had finished crossing the floor. Trask leaned close. Her voice was just above a murmur. "Aldrin just sent a message through his counsel," she said. "He's revising his cooperation agreement. He wants to add a name to his testimony that wasn't in the original plea." "Who?" Nora said. Trask said the name. Nora went still. It was not a name from the contractor. It was not a name from the Inspector General's office. It was not a name from Fort Carver or the compliance chain or any of the documentation she'd spent the last 3 days reading. It was a name she recognized from 2021, a name she recognized from the room where she'd been told her complaint was resolved and her reassignment was effective immediately. The officer who had received her report, the one who had listened and nodded, and 3 days later signed the document that routed everything into the reclassification file. The one she'd believed at the time had simply been outranked and outmaneuvered. She looked at Trask. "He didn't just bury it because he was told to," Nora said. "No," Trask said quietly. "He didn't." His name was Colonel Douglas Farr. Nora stood in the middle of the emergency department with a triage chart in her hand and let the name settle into the right place in her memory, which didn't take long. It had been sitting there for 5 years, filed under things she'd stopped letting herself think about directly, because thinking about them directly hadn't helped, and she'd needed to function. Farr had been her commanding officer's commanding officer in 2021. He'd sat across from her in a room at Fort Carver, with his hands folded on the desk and his uniform pressed, and his face doing the thing that senior officers did when they were managing a subordinate they'd already decided how to handle: attentive, measured, professionally sympathetic. He had told her he took her report seriously. He had used the word seriously twice. He had told her the matter would be reviewed through appropriate channels and that she should focus on her duties and trust the process. 3 days later, her transfer orders had arrived. She had believed, at the time, that Farr had simply been a man who'd chosen the institution over the individual, which happened, which was its own kind of wrong, but a comprehensible one. She'd understood institutional self-protection. She had filed it under things that were true and terrible and unchangeable and moved on. He hadn't been protecting the institution. He'd been protecting his own financial relationship with the contractor he'd helped select for the military working dog contract 2 years earlier, a relationship the DODIG had now traced through a consulting agreement that predated her report by 14 months and had continued generating payments through a shell company for 3 years after it. He'd sat across from her with his hands folded and told her he took it seriously. She finished the triage assessment. She logged it. She moved the patient to Bay 4. She did this because the alternative was standing still, and she had learned across many years and many situations that had required her to keep moving that standing still was where the damage accumulated. You processed while you worked. You let it settle into its place while your hands did what your hands knew how to do. Trask waited. She understood somehow that waiting was what was needed. After 4 minutes, Nora said, "How long have you known about Farr?" "We suspected for 9 months, Trask said. "We couldn't confirm the financial relationship without Aldrin's cooperation. The payments went through layers." A pause. "He retired 18 months ago. He's currently in Maryland." "Is he being detained?" Federal agents arrived at his home at 1 p.m. Eastern. Trask checked her watch. 40 minutes ago. Nora nodded. She picked up the next chart. "Nora," Trask said. She stopped. "What he did to you in 2021 is part of the federal charging document," Trask said. "By name. The suppression of your complaint, the false resolution, the transfer. It's all in there. It's going to be public record." She said it carefully, like she was making sure each word arrived. "He doesn't get to be a footnote." Nora looked at the chart in her hands. She thought about being 28 and sitting in that room and deciding afterward to trust the process. Not because she was naive, but because she'd needed something to hold on to, some version of the world where the institutions she'd served worked the way they were supposed to. She'd carried the weight of having been wrong about that for 5 years, and hadn't fully known how heavy it was until this moment, when Trask was telling her it was going down on record, official and permanent and public. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out slightly rougher than she intended. She didn't walk it back. She went back to work. Mutt. The federal charges were filed the following Monday, and they were everything Trask had said they would be, and then some. Harlan Vectis Group, its CFO, its compliance director, and 4 senior officers. Brigadier General Curtis Aldrin on 2 counts of conspiracy and 1 count of obstruction of a federal complaint. Colonel Douglas Farr on 3 counts, including the deliberate suppression of a formal service member complaint, and 1 count related to the financial relationship that had motivated it. 2 additional officials whose names Nora recognized from documentation but had never met. The charging documents were 43 pages. Her name appeared 11 times across those pages, not as a peripheral detail, but as the thread through which the entire suppression had been organized. Every attempt to minimize her, reassign her, and silence her was documented in federal language that was, by design, impossible to interpret as anything other than what it was. She testified in Billings on Monday afternoon. She sat in a room with federal prosecutors and a court reporter and Trask on one side of the table and gave 4 hours of testimony that started with 2021 and moved forward through every step she'd taken since. She was not perfect in that room. She hesitated twice when the questions touched the years she'd spent in Denton Falls. She asked to go off the record once and was gently told that wasn't possible. And she understood. And she answered the question anyway. She drank 3 cups of water across the afternoon. At one point, her voice went thin for exactly 1 sentence, and she waited for it to come back, and it did. When it was over and she was walking out, Obi, who had been quiet throughout, said, "That was the cleanest testimony I've seen in 3 years." "Don't tell me that," she said. "I'll second-guess every moment I hesitated." "The hesitations made it credible," he said. She thought about that for a moment. "Yeah," she said, "I know." She drove back to Denton Falls in the dark. 2.5 hours of highway and mountains and the particular Montana dark that was different from darkness anywhere else she'd lived. Total and also somehow clear, like the absence of light here was honest rather than just empty. She thought about Douglas Farr in Maryland with federal agents at his door. She thought about the shape of the last 5 years, not with bitterness, because bitterness was what you felt when you expected justice and didn't get it, and she'd stopped expecting it a long time ago, which meant what she felt now was something without a clean name. Not satisfaction exactly, something more like the specific stillness that comes when a thing you've been braced against stops pushing. She'd been braced for a long time. She let herself stop bracing just for the length of the drive. Kodiak's surgery was Friday morning, performed by Varga with a veterinary orthopedic specialist she'd brought up from Colorado. The procedure took 2 hours and 14 minutes and removed both fragments cleanly, with no nerve damage confirmed on intraoperative assessment. Marcus sat in the waiting area outside the surgical suite with his repaired shoulder in a stabilizing brace and his good hand wrapped around a paper coffee cup that had gone cold 40 minutes earlier. Nora sat beside him because she had the morning off. Halverson had given her 3 personal days, which was the hospital's way of acknowledging, without quite saying, that the week had been something that warranted acknowledgement. She hadn't argued about the days. She'd taken them. "He's going to be fine," she said. "I know," Marcus said. He was looking at the door. "I know that. I just need him to come out of that door." She understood that. There was a version of knowing things rationally and a version of actually being able to breathe again, and the second version required physical evidence. They waited. Varga came through the door at 11:42 with her surgical cap pushed back and the specific expression of someone who has done the thing they came to do. "Clean removal," she said. "Both fragments. The joint will need 8 weeks of structured rehab, but there's no reason he won't have full function." She looked at Marcus. "He's coming around from anesthesia. He's going to be groggy and confused for about an hour. He may not recognize you immediately." "That's okay," Marcus said. His voice was slightly unsteady in a way he didn't try to hide. "I'll wait." But Kodiak did recognize him. It took 4 minutes after they brought him to the recovery area. 4 minutes of the dog blinking at the ceiling and then at the walls with the unfocused confusion of coming back from sedation. And then his head turned and he found Marcus's face and his tail moved once, slowly, and that was enough. Marcus put his good hand on the dog's head and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Nora stood in the doorway and watched it, and felt something in her chest that she usually kept more managed than this. She let it be unmanaged for a moment. There was no one here keeping score. The hospital board met the following week. Nora was not in that meeting, but she received a summary from Halverson's office 2 days later in the form of a letter on hospital letterhead that was formal and also clearly written by someone who understood that formal language was inadequate to the situation and was trying anyway. The letter documented several things. Deborah Sutton's resignation, submitted voluntarily the day after the federal charges went public, citing personal reasons. The termination of Dr. Pressman's clinical privileges, effective immediately, pending a full ethics review of his consulting relationships and their influence on patient care decisions. A formal review of the emergency department's nurse assignment protocols, specifically the practice of long-term overflow assignment that had been applied selectively and in ways the review had found difficult to justify on operational grounds. And then the last paragraph, which Nora read 3 times. It offered her a position as lead clinical nurse for the emergency department, effective at her discretion, with a salary adjustment and a direct reporting relationship to the chief medical officer. The offer was accompanied by a formal acknowledgement. The language was careful and institutional, and also, underneath it, unmistakable, that her clinical judgment had been consistently accurate and frequently in advance of formal diagnostic conclusions, and that the department was better for her presence than it had recognized. She put the letter down on her kitchen table. She made coffee. She stood at the window and drank it. She thought about what she wanted, not what was fair, not what she'd earned, not what the institutional record now said about her. Those things were established, and she didn't need to keep counting them. She thought about what she actually wanted, which was a harder question and one she'd gotten out of the habit of asking. She wanted to stay. That was the answer, and it surprised her less than she expected. Not because Harwell Regional was perfect, or because Denton Falls was where she'd imagined ending up, but because she'd built something here in spite of everything, and building something in spite of everything was not nothing. The overflow bay had been a diminishment, but it had also been where she'd stood close enough to the gaps to see what fell through them, and she had caught things that would otherwise have been lost, and that was real work. And she didn't want to walk away from real work. She wanted to do it differently. She wanted to be in a position where when she flagged something, it didn't require someone to have nearly died before anyone checked. She called Halverson's office and accepted the position. 3 weeks later, the first federal plea agreement was finalized. The Vectis CFO received 12 years. The compliance director received 9. Aldrin's sentencing was pending full cooperation compliance, but the prosecutor's office had communicated publicly that the cooperation had been substantive and that the recommended sentence would reflect it, which meant he was going to spend years in a federal facility regardless of the discount, and the board seat, and the consulting contracts, and the wool coat, and the strategic positioning near windows were all behind him permanently. Farr's case went to trial rather than plea. He had apparently decided to contest the financial relationship documentation, which Nora found almost impressive in its stubbornness and not at all surprising. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. She would testify again. She'd been told to expect it. She had already decided she was prepared for it. Marcus was discharged on a Tuesday. He came down to the ER to find her before he left, which required him to navigate a floor he hadn't been authorized to access in a visitor capacity, which he did anyway because he was, as she had understood from the first day, someone who went where the situation required regardless of what the signs said. Kodiak was with him, moving differently already. The subtle wrongness in his gait was already less pronounced, the front right compensation beginning to release now that the source of it was gone. He would be better than this in 8 weeks. He was already better than he'd been in 14 months. He found her at the nursing station and pressed his shoulder against her leg in the way he'd done from the beginning. The greeting that was also an acknowledgement, the dog equivalent of, "I know you delivered with full body weight." She put her hand on his back. "How does the shoulder feel?" she asked Marcus. "Ask me in 6 months," he said. Same answer as last time. "Same shoulder," he said. He looked around the emergency department, the board, the bays, the movement of staff across the floor. "It looks different in here." "It looks the same," she said. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She thought about that. He was probably right. She was standing in the center of it rather than at the edge of it, and that changed the geometry of how a room looked. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Back to Colorado. Kodiak has a rehab program." He paused. "After that, I've been asked to consult with the DODIG on the transition program review. The whole framework for military working dog post-service clearance is being redesigned." He said it simply, without drama. "They want input from handlers." "Good," she said. "They also want input from people who know what falsified imaging looks like," he said. "I gave them your name." She looked at him. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "It's just a name on a list. But they're building something new, and it should have the right people in it." She thought about what building something new meant after a system had failed the way this one had. It didn't mean trusting the institution again automatically. It meant staying close enough to it to catch what fell through the gaps, which was what she'd been doing in the overflow bay without knowing it was the work. It was still the work. It was always the work. "Okay," she said. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, and she waited, and he said it. "You didn't move on. In 2021, you filed the report and they buried you, and you came here and you kept your eyes open." He paused. "That's not the same as moving on." "I told myself it was," she said. "I know." A beat. "I told myself some things too." They stood in the noise and movement of the ER, the two of them and the dog between them. And it was not a perfect moment, and neither of them tried to make it one. It was just the specific realness of people who had been through something standing in the aftermath of it and acknowledging that they were still standing. "Take care of him," she said, meaning Kodiak. "He takes care of me," Marcus said. He left. Kodiak paused at the door and turned and looked at her for 3 seconds with the clear, direct attention that she had understood from the beginning was his way of saying something that dogs didn't have words for. Then he followed Marcus through the door and was gone. She was back at the station 2 minutes later with a new chart in her hand. The department had 8 patients. 3 were straightforward. 2 were going to require judgment calls. 1 was going to require someone who had seen the thing before and knew what it looked like when it was trying to hide. That last one was hers. She'd spent a long time believing that the quiet was a compromise, that choosing the work over the visibility, the overflow bay over the fight, the institutional patience over the institutional anger had been a version of giving up. She'd been wrong about that, which was the thing about being wrong that you only understood from the other side of it. She hadn't been waiting. She hadn't been hiding. She'd been doing exactly what she was trained to do in exactly the conditions she was placed in. And when the moment required something more than that, she'd had it, because it hadn't gone anywhere. It had been there the whole time, the same way the shrapnel had been in Kodiak's shoulder, invisible on the standard scan, present in every compensating step. The things they buried didn't disappear. They just waited for someone to look in the right place. She looked at the chart. She looked at the board. She thought about Monday and the new title on the door and the phone call she'd returned this afternoon from the DODIG's office. Then she walked into Bay 2, introduced herself to the patient, and went to work. She had always been exactly what she was. It had just taken everyone else a long time to catch up.